For our next session, we'll be joined by panelists from here in Montana to discuss the various considerations of a just transition in our state, the economics, labor and workforce, and coal-dependent communities. First, we're joined by Mark Haggerty, who's a Senior Fellow of Energy on Energy and the Environment at the Center for American Progress. Mark is an applied economist focusing on developing tractable policy solutions to important economic, land use, and community challenges. He helps lead the center's team-based research in tax policy, rural economic development, and public lands around energy and economic transitions. Mark is an avid outdoor athlete who can be found typically on ridgelines, trails, and rivers across Montana and the West. He is the proud father of 2 daughters who are teaching him to eat local, waste less, and welcome and try new things. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen here for my slides. What I want to do today is just a couple of things. I want to start with some beginnings, talking about how we got to where we are in Montana's coal economy and transition, and then talk about what's happened since the beginnings and what's the status right now, and then share what I think is one of the most important pieces in transition, which is really a focus on public revenue and thinking about coal mining in Montana as one of the most important pieces, and highlighting Bighorn County as one of the most important places where transition is going to have big impacts and can potentially be addressed in Montana. So it's useful first to just remember that major coal mining in the West and in Montana is relatively recent. Here's Jimmy Carter in 1979 at a coal-fired power plant in Kentucky, promising that the United States was going to burn its domestic, cheap, and reliable coal to power the country and to insulate us from some of the uncertainty and volatility in global oil markets. He announced that the US would burn 1 billion tons of coal, and in the late 1970s, the country was mining only 700 million tons, so that was not an insignificant promise. Congress took a lot of steps to help make it happen, including putting limits on new natural gas-fired power plants, and coal grew from about 40% of our net generation nationally to 57%, and we did burn that 1 billion tons of coal by the mid-80s. It required a significant amount of coordination, both between the federal government, states, and industry partners to get this done. The scope of the 1971 Northwest Power Study in Montana and the Great Plains proposed dozens of major open pit mine mouth plants that would deliver energy from the center of the country where the resources existed, the Colorado Plateau, the Northern Great Plains, to the major cities, mostly across the West Coast. And there were only about 9,000 megawatts of coal-fired electricity in 1972. The study predicted that by 1980, we could be producing as much as 200,000 megawatts. A lot of that didn't come to pass, but it was a significant commitment to coordinate and to build this capacity. And it resulted in one of the West's most spatially extensive the world's most spatially extensive electricity grids. The entire US grid is interconnected, and that was not the case in the 1970s. This took a tremendous amount of planning and coordination to make happen. It was no small feat. And at the same time, the national ownership of the coal resource, especially in the Powder River Basin, enabled and encouraged the rapid development of coal for power across the country, not just across the West. So the large scale of the surface mines in the Powder River Basin had significant productivity advantages compared to the underground and mountaintop removal mining in the East. The railroad deregulation that happened really facilitated lower costs and the ability to ship this coal across the country. And it met the nation's acid rain regulatory goals with lower sulfur content in Western coal. So in less than 2 decades, the West witnessed this massive buildup of coal infrastructure, both for generation and for mining to delivery to power plants across the country. It's important because it demonstrates our ability to do rapid, serious work that is coordinated and has a significant role for the federal government and for private industry to make it happen. And the other really important piece about this period and kind of the lessons from where we got started is that the states really led the terms of how this was going to happen across the West. They set the social license to operate. And so learning from Art Link in North Dakota and the Western governors and leaders like Tom Tao in Montana, we learned from this legacy of hard rock mining and the boom and busts to make sure that as coal came, we were prepared for it. And what's really important about this period is that it's not anti-coal. It's also not pro-coal necessarily. It's really about geography and who benefits when we develop resources from our kind of remote rural communities and deliver them to urban sectors. Who benefits when we do that? How is that managed? And how can states ensure that workers and communities have some long-lasting benefits to show from that? So Montana imposed a 30% severance tax on coal mining, surface coal mining. We created a permanent fund at the state level. We invested half of that revenue. That trust fund is now worth more than $1 billion. We put in strong reclamation and bonding requirements, environmental regulations to make it happen. And the environmental community and labor worked together to make sure that workers in Montana would also be taken care of. So this, I think, is a good baseline to assess how have we done now that we're entering the period where coal is going away. What's happened in the interim from this development of the infrastructure and the beginning of coal mining to now at the end of life? And we saw a graph similar to this from Emily. We know that there are significant closures of coal-fired power plants happening across the country and in Montana. You can see this big buildup of capacity above the horizontal line in the late 60s to the mid 80s. And now below the horizontal line, these retirements and planned retirements really starting in earnest around 2011. These data are now about a year old. And so there are even more retirements being announced below the line as we go. One of the major reasons for the breakup of the coal-fired power fleet is cheap natural gas. The fracking boom in the early 2000s enabled the construction of more efficient natural gas-fired power plants. You can see this massive increase in natural gas capacity starting in the early 2000s. And then more recently, lower cost renewable, both wind and solar, that are also cutting into the advantages that coal used to have. And so it's not just the power plants that are closing though. The mines that are supplying these power plants are losing their customers. And this is a graph of coal mining in Bighorn County, Montana. You can see on the left axis, the county was producing somewhere between 3 and 4 million tons of coal every quarter through the decade 2000 to about 2010. It declined a little bit, but really what's notable is in the first 2 quarters of 2021, the production from Bighorn County has just plummeted as mines have entered bankruptcy and have ceased operations. And that's largely due to coal-fired power plants closing across the Midwest. So they're losing their customers. Another major development is that the social contract that we had in the 70s has been broken in some pretty meaningful ways that complicate transition. First, there's been a retreat from federal policy and regulation that's left an uncoordinated and often contradictory planning environment across the West. We've also had energy deregulation at the state level, which allowed regulated utilities to sell off some of their assets. And so in Colstrip, for example, when the 4 units were operating, there were 7 different owners of that power plant, each of which had different stakeholders and different planning environments, planning jurisdictions, and goals. And it made it very difficult for communities to try to understand the planning environment and how to engage with it. So it really moved the planning process from government to the private sector and made it much more difficult for transition to happen. And so that lack of federal oversight is also a significant challenge going forward. Another thing that's happened is we've become much more dependent on coal. So in Montana in particular, where we had good taxation, there was quite a bit of revenue coming in. A lot of communities in the state use that revenue to fund their annual operating budgets. We lowered other taxes. We don't need to have a sales tax in Montana because we are funded quite a bit from natural resource revenue. And that dependence complicates transition as well. So in Wyoming, for example, residents in Wyoming pay about $3,000 in taxes a year, and they receive something on the order of $30,000 in services because those services are largely being funded by the energy industry. It's not quite as acute in Montana, but we looked at counties across the West and compared revenue that they receive from property taxes, severance taxes, and royalty distributions to the county budget. And Bighorn County, Montana at the time was the most dependent local government on revenue from coal in the West. And one of the challenges is that economic diversification is not necessarily going to replace those revenues. This is some work that was done by the Montana Legislative Fiscal Division, staff that supports the legislature. And they looked at different sectors and their contributions to employment, personal income, GDP, and revenue. And you can see natural resources in the top left here provide only 1.4% of the state's jobs, but 6.5% of total revenue to the general fund. So the opportunity with natural resources is really a revenue opportunity, where a lot of the new growing sectors in Montana, like healthcare in the bottom right, are creating a lot of jobs, but they're not replacing the revenue necessarily to support services across the state. And so as we've become dependent on natural resource revenue, and as the economy is changing, some of the limits that we've put in place on taxation and revenue can become real barriers to revenue replacement in transition. The final thing that really complicates transition is we've seen major changes in the economy, where increases in productivity, which had typically led to more jobs and higher wages for most workers, have been decoupled. So rising productivity in manufacturing and other sectors no longer necessarily translates into jobs. So we're still producing quite a bit of output, and we are becoming more productive. This is a graph of manufacturing, but we don't need as many people to fill those jobs. And that is also true in a lot of energy sectors, where we lost 130,000 jobs in coal mining since the 1970s, while production remained largely flat up to about 2010. So what does this mean for transition today? I want to highlight the public revenue side of things. So we've become dependent on these natural resource sectors to fund our state and local governments. How can we get out of that to make sure that communities also have what they need to try to support high transition going forward? And what we've learned is that when you have a one-time opportunity associated with natural resources, rather than spending that money on an annual basis and becoming dependent on it, the theory and practice of resource economy suggests that you need to be saving and reinvesting that revenue into different capitals that allow you to transform your economy into something that is more diverse and more resilient over time. So the energy economy is not the end state, but is an opportunity to move from a relatively narrow economy, specialized economy, into something that is more diverse and resilient over time. And there's a really important proposal right now in DC that I just want to make sure people are aware of. It's from Senator Michael Bennet in Colorado, working with his coal-dependent communities and the Office of Just Transition in Colorado to try to change the way that revenue is managed, but also change the way that economic transition assistance can be delivered. And it's modeled a little bit on a proposal that Senators Wyden and Crapo developed for timber-dependent communities in the Pacific Northwest. The idea is to take annual revenue from coal and other fossil fuel extraction, and instead of spending it, invest it in a permanent fund. That permanent fund is managed by a federally chartered corporation that can really package and organize a lot of the revenue and assistance going to transition. So it's a way to try to deal with some of the alignment and coordination that's necessary between federal and states and communities. And then that dedicated funding source with this new institution can deliver the revenue replacement, work with communities to build their capacity and readiness for transition, and then focus on both financing and grants to help implement locally led strategies for energy transition. So this kind of approach to thinking about the revenue replacement in the public revenue side is a really necessary piece that I think is lost a little bit in some of the conversations. And so the working group at the federal level on coal transition has focused a lot on labor, and they've identified communities based on their potential to lose employment opportunities. But the revenue opportunity is just as critical to make sure that we're not only taking care of workers, but that the communities have the resources they need to support those families that want to stay in those locations. So I'm going to end there, and I will be around for the rest of this session and the rest of the day to answer questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting, really excellent work. It's really nicely visually presented. Appreciate that. Next, we're joined by Charlene Johnson. Charlene is the Executive Director and founder of the Plenty Doors Community Development Corporation. She is a member of the Apsalalka Nation in Montana. She has lived on or near the Crow Reservation for most of her life. She obtained her education at Montana State University in Bozeman and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to Plenty Doors CDC, Charlene worked with the Indian Health Service for almost 25 years as a public health nutritionist and an administrator. Her interest in starting a nonprofit organization focused on community economic development started while working with the Indian Health Service. Welcome, Charlene.
Thank you very much. And boy, that's a hard act to follow, isn't it? So anyway, so yeah, my name's Charlene Johnson, the co-founder and executive director for Plenty Doors Community Development Corporation. So we're a 501c3 that's located on the reservation, and our intent is to create thriving communities through diversifying the economy and building individual and community capacity. So the Crow Reservation is located in southeastern Montana. I'm just going to share a slide. I'm sorry. My slides are not as dynamic as Mark's. I apologize, but wait, that's not where I want to be. Sorry. Let me see, where are we at? There we go. Can everyone see my slide? Sure.
Charlene, we're seeing your email. Now we're seeing your slide, and yeah, if you put that in.
Okay, good deal. All right. So the Crow Reservation is located in southeast Montana, and it's home to the Apsalalka Nation. The Crow Nation has over 14,000 members, with approximately half of them living on the reservation. The Crow tribe has been dependent on coal for over 45 years, and Bighorn County, as Mark stated earlier, that's where, anyway, the Bighorn County is primarily the Crow Reservation. As he said, is the most dependent, coal-dependent county in the nation. So at the peak of coal, up to 75% of the revenue that was received by the Crow tribe was from coal revenue. And with the decline in coal, the Crow tribe was forced to lay off over 1,000 of their 1,300 employees. So, and so that was back in 2017. We started in 2018. Within the year of starting Plenty Doors, we also had the Crow Tribal Administration and the only full service grocery store burn, and so we no longer have a grocery store. And so so we're very coal dependent, but we have issues within our communities. So our communities have failing infrastructure. We have multiple families that live in a single home, in homes that are not meant to house as many people as they do. So, you know, of course, the wear and tear on your home is going to be more significant. And we're experiencing a phenomenon, I can't even say it. Anyway, a new issue in our community that we've never dealt with before. And that is homelessness on our reservation. And we used to not have that at all. And so we also lack locally run community-based businesses and or the economic infrastructure to support them. And so I also wanted to give you a little history, and the reason why I have this picture, this is actually a picture of our original territory. So in 1968, the 1968 Laramie Treaty, in that treaty outlines the description of where our territory is. And so if you see the black line with the wigglies, these here is our territory. So the 1868 treaty reduced our area down to the original reservation, and you look at this line here. And so during that treaty, you know, we were promised that we would have education, and we would have healthcare, and we would have food. Therefore, kind of creating the dependency that we have on the federal government. And so, so the impact of coal, the coal industry, is just one factor that has resulted in where we're at today. So of the 12 years of the 45 years that we've had coal tax revenue, the coal tax revenue went to the federal government, to the state government, and to the county government, but none went to the tribe. And so for 12 of those 45 years. So the other thing that has happened is that when the federal government put Native people on Indian reservations, we were now not allowed to tax or even to function. So we have no revenue to function like other governments. So it just set our reservations up to fail. Prime example of systemic racism. And so again, without tax revenue, we have nothing to run our governments. You know, we had the tax revenue that for years had helped the tribes to leverage for grants. And so, for example, when we had the decline in coal, we not only had the loss of jobs, but we also had the loss of programs. We utilized those coal revenues to use as match for government funding like the Head Start program. So now with our revenue down, we no longer have the level of funding to provide matches for programs like Head Start. And so we no longer have Head Start. And what happened in that situation is that from the fact that we no longer have Head Start, we lost 90 jobs, and we lost Head Start services to over 300 children. The other thing is just the perception that Native people receive regular government checks. And just so that you know, the government checks come in the form of Indian Health Service and BIA and the grants that we apply for that are federally funded. And even with the per capita checks come from the revenue from coal. And so now that the coal, our monies from coal has declined, our per capita checks are dwindling as well. And so just wanted to provide that bit of education. So I wanted to, I'm sorry, you can tell I'm a little nervous, sorry. So let me just tell you a little bit about Plenty Doors. So Plenty Doors, our mission is to improve our communities through economic development individual and community capacity building, and business development, promotion, and preservation of our culture, environment, and food sovereignty. And our theory of change is that we know our Abzaliga people possess the ability and the intelligence and talent to control and determine our own destiny. We don't need to be dependent on outside entities to do the work that is needed or to determine what's best for our communities. So accordingly, we believe that Plenty Doors can foster community change by engaging Abzaliga people in locally driven efforts to improve our communities through economic development, individual and community capacity building, and just as our mission said, all of that. So given adequate resources, our Abzaliga people will be a sovereign nation that will determine for ourselves how we can create a good future for our children and those to come. And so at Plenty Doors, what we have tried to do is that we've identified some strategic focus areas. And these focus areas are creating a venue for grocery stores and small businesses, utilizing a multi-use approach, multi-use building. We provide business support to entrepreneurs and small businesses and existing businesses. And then we also are working toward becoming a certified community development financial institution. So currently we're an emerging CDFI. This is an area that we feel so strongly about, is strengthening our workforce through partnership and also supporting the assets of our community. And so currently we work closely with the Little Bighorn College on trying to expand that in our effort to build capacity in our community. And more recently, we've added water, sanitation, and hygiene to our list of focus areas. During COVID, where that came from was during COVID, when we were part of that response, we found that the need was so great. And we also found that the number of households that lacked water or safe water was exaggerated because individuals needed safe or clean water to maintain their hygiene and hopefully prevent the spread of COVID. So in all that we do, that we try to do, we try to ensure that we're building capacity. And so that not only means individual, but community capacity. So during COVID, what we found is that we lack so much capacity in our community. So we do individual capacity building through education and training of individuals, and for businesses and organizations. We assist and we partner with other entities like the Little Bighorn College. So they've expanded their workforce development program to include plumbing and electrical. We currently don't have those services, but 5 years from now, we hope to have our own plumbers and our own electricians and our own carpenters and HVAC people who are able to help us maintain our homes and to build new homes for our families. The other thing that we do is we collaborate and we complement. There's so much need in our community that it's not productive to compete with one another. And so in all that we do, that we try to collaborate and complement with other organizations. And we try to be inclusive in that we try to do everything by connecting people and by consensus. And consensus is how our leaders in the past made decisions. We have a weekly call that we call the community conversation. And actually, I just got off of that call before I joined this. But it's a way for individuals to come together and talk about the issues in our community and how to come up with potential solutions. And some of the things that we have done as a nonprofit have come from that weekly community conversations. And so So that's what we're doing here at Plenty Doors. So any questions? I'll be here until the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Charlene. And yes, we'll take questions and answers and we'll kind of open up our panel after our next speaker. But before I introduce our next speaker, I just wanted to say, so I work at High Plains Architects, so send greetings from Randy and Emery, and we've worked with Charlene, and you're doing really great work there. So appreciate your joining us and giving us some important context for cold community and cold impacts and the changes in the transition. So our final panelist is James Holbrook, who's the Executive Secretary of Montana AFL-CIO. James Holbrook was born and raised in Billings and currently serves as Executive Secretary of the Montana AFL-CIO, a federation of 38 unions representing nearly 50,000 workers across Montana. Holbrook spent 18 years as a Montana Combination Station / Central Office Technician with US West, Quest, and CenturyLink, where he served as Chief Steward, Representative, and Treasurer for IBEW Local 206 before being elected Business Manager in 2014. He has served as Secretary Treasurer for the Montana State Conference of Electrical Workers, a board member for the Big Sky Central Labor Council, and a board member for the Montana AFL-CIO. A U.S. Army veteran and father of 4, James currently lives in Helena with his wife of 23 years. So welcome, James.
Thank you, and thank you to Julie Holzer and Sydney Austin and Northern Plains for the invite to today's panel. I'm here to touch on labor and unions specifically in their role in transition. But before we can talk about that role, we have to touch on a few things, mainly what unions do, why they matter, and why they're important to Montana. And in the prep for this the other day, I joked around that if I was talking for 20 minutes, which is my allotted time, that would be crazy. But that first question, what is a union? I could talk for days on that. So I'm not going to do that to you all. I'm going to give you a 50,000 foot overview of what unions are, and I will put my email in the chat. So if you have any questions, oops, forgot the J, sorry. That looks better. If you have any questions about unions in general, or if you know someone that needs a union, or just have general questions about your rights as workers, feel free to reach out and contact me. So a union basically is a collective of like workers coming together through collective bargaining to have a say in their workplace for wages, benefits, and working conditions. What is it that they do? They provide opportunities for living wages and benefits and the ability to retire with dignity and respect. They open the door to PLAs, or project labor agreements. PLAs are construction agreements with one or more unions that set the terms and conditions for construction jobs being done. The participating unions man the jobs with a well-trained and skilled workforce. Unions also set prevailing wage rates through collective bargaining agreements. That raises all boats, levels the bidding field for construction jobs, and decreases income inequality across the board. They also provide corporate accountability and a way to protect workers from retaliation for reporting corporate violations of the collective bargaining agreement, or even violations of the law. So creating fairness in the workplace and setting the bar for others is right in line with Montana values. Now we get into transition. So transition is it's more than just the flick of a switch, as we all know. We need to bring everyone along with us in any transition to renewables. Leaving large swaths of this country with depressed wages just won't do. Unions are a key tool in fighting income inequality, supporting community vitality, and giving people hope that their retirement and family will be supported well into the future. So there's some problem trends with ongoing transitions. Corporations are actively seeking to suppress wages through union busting. Nationally, only about 4% of solar industry workers and 6% of wind workers are unionized. According to the 2020 U.S. Energy and Employment Report, the percentage of unionized workers in natural gas, nuclear, and coal power plants is about double that, or 10 to 12%, although that's still not a huge amount. In energy transportation, distribution, and storage jobs, which exist largely in fossil fuel sectors, about 17% of the jobs are union. Still, the solar and wind unionization rates are in line with the low national rate of unionized workers in the private sector, which is down around 6.3%. So, for example, building an electric power plant powered by fossil fuels usually requires hundreds of electricians, pipe fitters, millwrights, boiler makers, who can typically earn $100,000 a year in wages and benefits when they belong to a union. On solar farms, workers are often non-union construction laborers who earn an hourly wage in the upper teens with modest benefits, if any at all. According to Jim Harrison, the director of renewable energy for the Utility Workers Union of America, the clean tech industry is incredibly anti-union. It's a lot of transient work that is marginal, precarious, and difficult to be able to organize. This opens the door for corporations to circumvent prevailing wage standards as well. Prevailing wage standards don't just help union workers, they set the pay scale by which others have to compete. That lifts all boats and all wages. Without unions, you have wage suppression and oppression across the board, contributing to widespread economic inequality. When prevailing wage is circumvented, non-union workers get the bids. They work for less and are often untrained and often from outside of Montana. Not only does this lead to wage suppression more broadly, but your tax dollars are not being invested back into the Montana communities. Union busting and circumventing prevailing wages will help make the rich richer, but actions like these will only destroy the middle class. So we must do better. We must hold these corporations accountable in order to achieve both economic justice goals and climate change goals. This should include the retraining of workers in these fossil fuel industries. What does retraining entail, and what do people and communities go through in transition? This is where unions come in. Unions are fighting for retraining dollars through the American Rescue Plan Act. Unions are fighting for remediation work in communities like Colstrip. Who is doing this work right now? Should be Montana union workers, but the majority of this work is being done by out-of-state workers. Without union advocacy, these displaced workers would be left to fend for themselves and most likely have to move to find work in their field, despite Republican legislation that was passed in 2019 to protect this work and pay prevailing wages for the work being done. Unions are seeking money to offset the cost of union workers starting over in apprenticeship programs. When unions fight for living wages and benefits, it's not just for the moment, it's for the future of the worker. When a worker is displaced from a career job like a boilermaker, a plant operator, or a mine worker, they don't just lose their income, they lose their path to retirement, a path that was almost guaranteed when they started working. Most pensions take 5 years to vest in, and most don't fully appreciate until 20 or 30 years in their career. If we care about our fellow citizens and communities, we must find a way to transition workers to a path that still allows for retirement in dignity and respect. Transition may include the possibility of advanced nuclear power in Colstrip. Montana still needs dispatchable power. Fossil fuels aren't going to go away tomorrow, but the tech is here today to make them cleaner and more efficient, like carbon capture and storage, or CCS, and enhanced oil recovery. I'm going to copy a link here for everyone. Hopefully. If you all would visit that website and watch those videos, very educational on the new tech out there, how to make our existing technologies cleaner and more productive. Transition must consider the loss of jobs due to plant and pipeline shutdowns as well. We must retain the established value in these communities being affected by these transitions. Without planning and careful consideration, we'll lose more than a viable workforce to be retrained. The economic devastation dealt to these workers could be life-threatening. Just think for a moment about workers living in Colstrip or Bighorn County. Think about that worker not only losing their livelihood, but to find their largest investment, their home, worth pennies on the dollar due to the vacuum of industry loss. And finally, the only viable transition plan needs to include unions and PLAs and pay living wages and benefits with a path to retirement with dignity and respect. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, James. And now we have some time for some Q&A, and apologize again with the virtual nature of this is not going to be quite as interactive as a panel typically is, but Charlene, if you could also turn on your camera and so we can all see you all. Some of the questions, most of the questions, some of the questions are directed to certain people. Others may be a little more open-ended, but this first question is sort of maybe most directed to Mark, maybe as a good starting point. Can we do policy that we pay for loss of coal tax revenue with the savings we gain from lower cost renewable energy?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the challenge with revenue is that because fossil fuels are so fuel intensive, right? I mean, we've got the coal, you have oil and gas, they're valuable commodities, they're exported from Montana. So taxing them is very easy. You can generate a tremendous amount of revenue with no impact on Montanans because we're ultimately not paying that tax. That tax is being paid by consumers that are, using the energy in Minnesota, in Oregon, and Washington, and elsewhere. Renewable energy doesn't have that fuel source. And so it's hard to replace those severance taxes and royalties. Property taxes can be really important for local governments, right? But that savings, I'm not sure exactly what the savings refers to, but it's not, we're not going to generate more revenue from renewable energy than we have from fossil fuels. Even if we continue to export those. So really what's required is to diversify our revenue structure to be able to tax the underlying economy. What we've done by relying on fossil fuels is we don't tax Montanans as much as we might otherwise. So we've enjoyed low taxes for a long time. We don't have a sales tax. That's going to have to change at some point if we need to try to maintain the level of services that we've become accustomed to. So yeah, it's going to be a real difficult challenge.
Thank you, Mark. Anybody else want to comment on that question? Question for Charlene, or a comment. Charlene, thank you for all your powerful work. Mark laid out some serious changes coming down the line. What are the best ways organizations like Northern Plains can work to support your work and be a good ally in this transition?
I think starting with the conversation would certainly help on how just understanding where our commonalities are. And the most important thing is taking our lead. We've done some work with other organizations who've been done that, who've been respectful of our knowledge and our desire to just determine what's best for us. And that's worked out very well. There's been times when we've had people who've come in and who've said, well, we can do this for you, and have just come to our doorstep, so to speak, to tell us, that they could do this and this for us. And oftentimes that isn't what we need. In order for us to be the strong nation that we desire to be again, that we need to determine what that is. And we need to struggle. We need to make our mistakes. We need to fall down and get back up. And so we need to be the ones who do that. And individuals, partners who have been the partners who have said, well, we're here. We need, when we've said we need this expertise, and they have come and respectfully brought their expertise, that's when it's most helpful. So I think the first step is let's talk.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question looks to be addressed to Mark. You say that we should save funds derived from energy sources to help with the transition. But on the other hand, states use those funds to fund programs because there are few other taxes that can provide funds. So how do you use the funds to provide for current programs and at the same time save large portions of those funds for the future?
I think there's two opportunities right now. One is at the federal level. Federal royalties, like Charlene mentioned, are produced locally. They are collected by the Office of Natural Resource Revenue in DC, and then they are distributed. About half of those come back to the states. And then Montana shares a portion of that with the local governments, with the counties, not the tribal governments, but the counties. There is quite a bit of interest right now in DC about a just transition and making sure that the loss of revenue does not become both a fiscal crisis for those communities that are trying to provide services, but it also doesn't become a political barrier to avoid making the hard choices. And so this proposal to take the federal revenue, put it into an endowment that can build wealth and provide permanent payments to communities is, a really good idea. And the federal government has the resources potentially to replace short-term revenue with appropriations if we have a long-term plan to make sure that we don't need appropriations to fund transition permanently, because we're starting to build this endowment, we're building up this wealth. So that's a really interesting and I think important proposal. At the state level in Montana, we have $1 billion coal tax trust fund. And right now, the principal is protected and the principal should be protected going forward. That is the legacy of our coal mining in the state, and it should be there forever. But the way those funds have been allocated, the income that it earns, have been allocated across the state to economic development projects that are not necessarily targeted to help with the community's transition. So Bighorn County built up probably 60% of the value of that fund in coal that was delivered from Bighorn County. Some portion of those distributions ought to go back to Bighorn County now and help them with transition. So we may rethink the way that we allocate those distributions to workforce retraining, to help, ensure that good jobs are produced in the state. There are a lot of things the state could do in that realm to make sure that communities have the resources they need to continue to provide services in the short term as the coal revenue goes away, and to think longer term about the kinds of investments we can make in transition back into those communities. So creating an endowment at the federal level and using Montana's endowment more effectively can start to replace some of that revenue. But then, as I mentioned before, we're going to have some conversations about other ways to generate revenue from sectors in Montana that are actually growing right now.
Great. Anybody else want to comment on what Mark's been discussing? Got a couple of questions for James. So one is, how can we increase union jobs and membership and unionization in the renewable energy industry? How do we overcome existing barriers to unionization? And then a follow-up, or from someone else is, does IBEW have an organizing strategy for hard to organize renewable energy workers?
Great questions. Do they have a specific strategy for organizing these industries? I don't think strategy is specific to any one industry. Organizing is key to every industry, and it's very broad and very general. The key is exciting workers to come together and realize that they can have a say in their workplace to determine their working conditions and their wages and their benefits. So I don't think that any one industry is necessarily harder to organize than any other. It's a matter of getting the people who work in these industries to realize what they have the power to grasp, and not letting others do the work. The worker is the union. Somebody sitting in my seat is not the union.
Maybe a follow-up question that I just sort of ad-libbing, but are there things that people who are not directly a worker themselves, I mean, I think ultimately, you know, the workers who are have the self-interest and desire to have their workplace be unionized, so that's the most important entity. But are there things that people outside of that, such as in their communities, can be doing to help ensure that those unions thrive, that union jobs are being created?
Nothing more than conversation. That's all it takes, is talking to your neighbors and talking to people that you know in these industries, and letting them know that, hey, you have the power within your grasp to change your life, to make things better. And if there's any question on what union may be a better fit, what umbrella basically that these workers may fall under, that's a great opportunity. Just send me an email and we can get you in touch with multiple organizers to have that discussion. So
good. Another question that I'm not sure quite who it's directed to, and so we'll see which of you is most interested in taking it. There seems to be a trend we are seeing with COVID that that it's now an employee's market, or when it's employees market, people are paid more and given better benefits. They are no longer need to work 2 or more jobs. So perhaps the efficiency in our systems is not going to lead to the deficit we often talk about in terms of total jobs needed to be fulfilled in the transition. Question mark. Anybody want to take that?
I think that the market is finally catching up to realize that workers have value. It doesn't matter what the work is dignified and worthy of a living wage. So you see fast food restaurants advertising anywhere from $14 to $20 an hour just to cook food. Those are not beginning jobs. That's a dignified job that has a place in our society, and it's worth a living wage. So I'm not sure if it's more of a statement, but yeah, it's definitely worth recognizing that the market is finally realizing that.
I agree with that, James. I mean, there's certainly a lot of new pressure and new understanding that the way employment has worked in this country for the last couple of decades has not worked for a lot of people, right? Especially in lower wage retail and service jobs where scheduling is uncertain. It's really difficult to juggle a family, juggle other responsibilities, and COVID has really put that into the fore, where a lot of folks have dropped out of the labor market because they're taking care of family members, or the wages just don't justify their time anymore. So that's a good thing. The rising pressure on wages, I think, is a really positive thing for the labor market. I don't know that this is in terms of trying to answer the question, is this going to effectively mean that fewer people working the jobs means that the jobs go further, is the way that I understand that question. I'm not sure that's actually going to be the case. The pressure on automation and productivity is only going to accelerate. Fast food places are going to get tired of paying $14 to $20 an hour. And already I have a 14-year-old who works at McDonald's, and a lot of that is being automated. When you go to restaurants, you're going to be interfacing with iPads and not with people. And so the push to continually reduce your labor costs is not going to slow, it's going to accelerate. So I think the pressure on wages and the recognition of unions as a really important piece of the conversation about the transition is all good. I do worry about the continued pressure on automation and what that's going to mean ultimately for the labor market and for people's ability to enter the labor market and continue to deal with all of the other pressures that they face. So I don't think we know yet, but I don't think it's an easy answer.
Can I follow up on that? Thanks, Mark. Automation and the effects of that are a serious consideration for labor across the board. And the biggest way to get in front of that is to organize, to organize your workplace and get into a union and have a say in how those automations affect your workplace and how you're going to be able to work through that or come out on the other side of that. So great opportunity to pass the PRO Act and give everybody an open opportunity to do that. So.
Well, I would say that I do believe that it's a good thing that there has been an increase in pay for our service workers, because at this point it's so concerning. So one of the things that we always talk about is the future for our children, what our earth is going to look like, how are our children going to survive in this society. And so I agree that this increase in wages for our service employees is probably just short term. But as a country, I think we need to look at, what do we want for our future? Is it just for the few who are rich, or do we want to look at the whole country? And so on the Crow Reservation, anyway, we're looking at our whole nation. How can we improve conditions and the future for our whole AFL-CIO nation? And not just myself, or not just the politicians or the business owners, but I think, and I don't know that this is a place to talk about this, but as a country, I think we need to start looking at the whole. How are we as a country going to be a great country again? And you look at our people around, you look at the streets. I went to Missoula a couple of weeks ago, and in our hotel, next to our hotel, there was a camp of homeless people. Even in Crow Agency, where we're already poor, there's homeless people. And so, one of the things that, I'd like to challenge our rule makers and our policy makers is to look at that, to not just look at ourselves, but look at how our actions impact the whole versus a group of people. But anyway, thank you.
Looks like a lot of the other questions have been answered to various degrees. Yeah, okay. So a question for James. Can you please talk more about the PRO Act, PRO Act, and its likelihood to pass. And maybe if you could also tell us what that is.
Okay. Great question for those that don't know. See if I can. So so the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, how likely it is to pass, that's anybody's guess. There are pieces of the PRO Act that have been put into the reconciliation bill that will be determined by the deciding factor of who's in charge of reconciliation at that time. What we're asking as far as labor is contact your legislators, your representatives, your senators, ask them to support that. In general, what the PRO Act does is cut decades of red tape put in place by corporate America. It's going to open the door to workers to easily organize their workplace, to easily come together to have a say on their wages, benefits, and working conditions. Nothing even comes close to this legislation since the passage of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. So this is a huge piece of legislation if you're in the workforce and want to make your working life better. So
the comment first, and then it'll lead to a question or a series of questions. Thanks, Northern Plains and all presenters for this informative session, and thanks to Charlene for highlighting the need for environmental justice in the midst of a just transition. We must use this opportunity of systemic change to account for past transgressions towards tribal communities. Questions for anyone. Are there any considerations to retrofit our coal generation facilities like Colstrip into a thermal storage facility? Nuclear construction is rife with extreme budget and project timeline overruns. It can take 30 years or more to see it produce a single electron. Enhanced oil recovery requires large land impacts through pipelines and oil pads while also creating more greenhouse gas emitting products. Thermal storage can utilize existing infrastructure, keeping existing jobs to maintain the turbines and other parts of the power plant, aside from the boilers. It then allows for energy storage when renewables are overproducing and arbitrage pricing in the energy markets. Anyone want to take that?
Mark? No, I don't know of any existing talks of that technology, but this is the forum to bring those up and bring those to the forefront. So those technologies can be recognized as an opportunity to clean up our energy and make it more efficient going forward. So
yeah, I think this afternoon we've got some speakers who can speak to different options for technology and what might be viable in Montana. I don't want to tackle that directly, but maybe to just pick up on Charlene's comments again. One of the challenges that we've had in rural America for a long time is that we're producing a lot of value, right? There are significant industry, manufacturing, energy, agriculture, timber, mining that's still happening in rural places, but all that wealth is being extracted. The ownership isn't necessarily local. The productivity has reduced the number of employees that are necessary. The erosion of unions have made those jobs less well-paying jobs with fewer benefits. And it doesn't really matter what the next round of economic development is. if we don't solve those fundamental economic challenges, how do we make sure that whoever's going to work in renewable energy, or whether it's carbon sequestration and capture, whatever these projects are, how do we ensure that those are good jobs and families can actually build wealth from their employment opportunities? And then how do we make sure that communities can actually capture and retain and reinvest in themselves too, so that we can support the schools and the amenities and the services to make sure that families can live in those places? And so a lot of these strategies, at least the way economic development thinking is going now, the strategies have to be locally led. Communities need the capacity to actually develop those strategies, but they also need to be supported. And that support isn't just appropriations. It needs to be some kind of fundamental rethinking about the relationships between where the value is being produced and who benefits. And so I think I started with that, but just to drive that home again, and it really is as important as thinking about what the actual economic development might be. It might even be more important than thinking about what the actual economic development might be. And they obviously need to go hand in hand, but that's the way that I am starting to think about this stuff. And so the technology conversations are fascinating, and we need to start integrating those in with labor and economic development and community development conversations.
Excellent. Question, what are some options for representing gig and transitional workers and those who aren't in a job where union representation is available? Are there ways to support those workers at the state level?
Well, I don't believe there's any job out there that's not able to be represented. But that's a pretty broad question. If they want to contact me, and I can get them in touch with some organizers and have that conversation offline. So.
Yeah, so basically the solution to not being organized is to get organized.
Exactly.
So just got another question come in. Unions in some way are dependent on large corporations that have a bad history of hurting workers, like taking pensions away from workers while paying high bonuses for CEOs, communities, and our state. How can labor look at collaboration with environmentalists who often also oppose carbon capture and sequestration, as it looks like another corporate scam that is economically unproven, to find other solutions in our state that don't rely on those corporate bosses?
I don't think unions are exclusive, or for that matter, to inexclusive to any one industry. It doesn't matter if your employer is a bad actor or if your employer is the greatest employer you've ever had in your entire life. You still have the right to be organized. As far as working with different groups, I don't think that there's any one group that we would not talk to for transition of energy. We want to have these conversations to make sure we bring everyone with us in order to accomplish all of our goals, social, economic, and keeping our world a viable place for our kids and grandkids. So I don't think that we would not talk to anyone specifically. So.
Great. Is there a way for society as a whole to benefit from automation rather than the current model of more for a few and less for many? For example, could workers be the owners of the technology that replaces them? Or could extra profits from artificial intelligence go to escrow, similar to what we have done with coal?
That's a great question. There are lots of people thinking about that. There's an economist named Mariana Mazzucato who's thought a lot about how the economy works and how innovation happens, and what's the public's role and what's the public's value from that. And she uses the example of an iPhone and says, all of the basic technology that enables the iPhone was funded by government research. It was conducted in government labs. So Siri, the internet, GPS technology, all of that stuff. So the government is often investing early in risky technology development and innovation. What the private sector is really good at is taking that innovation and turning it into products that are really useful for people, that can help drive economic development and growth. And so this relationship between the public and the private is often overlooked, right? We celebrate Steve Jobs as the innovator and the risk taker, when in fact it was largely the government that took the big risks up front. And what Steve Jobs is really brilliant at is taking that innovation and turning it into useful products. And that's not unrisky. But the problem is that we've kind of created this narrative where the private sector deserves all of the rewards because they're taking all of the risks. And we don't have good mechanisms to recognize public-private partnerships and to really think about what the government is good at, what the private sector is good at, and to work together in a way that increases the total value that we are producing, both public and private, but then also to share some of those rewards. In theory, our tax system is supposed to be the way that we share those returns to the private sector, but we all know that those companies don't pay much in terms of taxes. And so we might need some other mechanisms to try to produce the shared values that we have. There are a lot of ideas there, too many to go into. Not all of them are popular or uncontroversial, but I think just that basic framing and understanding helps us think about how we might turn innovation and automation into something that could be more broadly shared.
Great. So we have time for one more question before we go into break. I know that transition planning around Colstrip has addressed cleanup of the settling ponds. Is the union engaged in the plans of this proactively?
The union has been in discussion and even during the legislative process of this whole goings on in Colstrip and cleaning up the ash ponds and whatnot. But to my earlier statement, now we're fighting for the workers that have been displaced from the closures of those plants in Colstrip and advocating for them to have the right to do the work for remediation. That Senate bill passed in 2019, I think it was Senate Bill 264 from Senator Jason Small, advocated for all remediation work in Colstrip to pay prevailing wage, which again sets the bar for everybody. And now the unions are fighting for those workers because that's not happening. So like I said, out of state workers coming into Montana and doing that work and taking that money and those tax revenues elsewhere. So yeah, we're involved now. We're fighting for the workers. So
yeah. Okay, thank you. So looks like we have a break now. I just want to thank all of our panelists. This is a very good discussion and great presentations. So we're going to take a break until 11:35, and then I invite you all to join us, or maybe shortly before that, as we talk about the role of power companies in a transition to a clean energy future. So thanks again for joining us for this first part, and yeah, we'll look forward to giving you a quick break, and we'll see you in a bit.